My name is Celeste Harmon. I am 38 years old. On a gray Tuesday afternoon in the third week of March, I sat in a beige-carpeted conference room on the fourth floor of a downtown Charlotte law office, in a chair that was slightly lower than everyone else's at the table, and I listened to a man I had never met before read what was supposed to be my grandmother's last will and testament. His name was Warren Fitch. He was 60, maybe 62, with the kind of unremarkable face designed to project neutrality, and trained to do it for decades. He read efficiently and without drama. My father, Raymond Harmon, 64 years old and wearing the charcoal sport coat he reserved for occasions he considered significant, sat with both hands flat on the table in front of him. My mother, Sylvia, 62, was in a cream-colored blouse and her good pearl earrings. My brother Connor, 41, sat across from me with his ankles crossed and his chin slightly lifted in the manner of a man who already knows how a story ends. Warren Fitch read through the standard language of the document. He read through the recitations of competence and the revocation of prior instruments. And then he reached the distribution clause. "To my grandson, Connor James Harmon," he said, in a voice that carried the same weight as someone confirming a lunch reservation, "I leave all real property, including the residence at 1412 Magnolia Lane, Concord, North Carolina, and all investment accounts held in my name, estimated at a combined value of $840,000, to be administered as sole beneficiary." He paused. He turned a page. "To my granddaughter, Celeste Marie Harmon, I leave the carved rosewood jewelry box currently resting on the nightstand in the primary bedroom." My father exhaled. It was a very small sound, but I heard it. My mother's hand found my father's wrist under the table. I saw it. Connor's chin came down 2 degrees. He pressed his lips together in a way that was not quite a smile, but was not a smile either. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I held the leather portfolio in my lap and looked at the middle distance. What they didn't know was that I had been waiting 6 months for this exact moment. What they didn't know was that the rosewood jewelry box Warren Fitch had just described was already sitting on my kitchen counter in Charlotte. And what they didn't know was what was no longer inside it. This is that story. My grandmother, Frances Aldridge, spent the last 22 years of her life in a yellow clapboard house on Magnolia Lane in Concord, North Carolina, 11 miles north of Charlotte, in a quiet residential neighborhood where the sidewalks were lined with oak trees and the neighbors knew each other's names. The house was not large. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a screened back porch where she kept 2 rocking chairs and a wind chime she'd had since before my mother was born. She had moved there after my grandfather, Harold Aldridge, died of a heart attack in the summer of 2002, and she had made that house into the kind of place that holds warmth, the way good wood holds heat, long after the fire is out. There were handmade quilts folded over every arm of every chair. There were photographs in frames that covered one entire wall of the hallway, organized not by year, but by person, so that if you stood there long enough you could trace the whole story of a family. There were herb pots on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, and the permanent smell of something baking or recently baked, and a silence that was never uncomfortable, the silence of a person at peace with herself. Frances was 81 years old when she died, in the first week of January of last year, and she had been sharp and funny and precise until the final 4 months of her life, when a series of small strokes began to quietly dim what had been an extraordinarily clear mind. I have a memory of her from when I was 6 years old, sitting at her kitchen table with a ledger she had kept since the 1970s, showing me how she balanced her accounts each month, column by column, penny by penny. "The numbers always tell the truth," she said to me. "People don't always, but the numbers do." I was 6 years old and I thought it was the most interesting thing anyone had ever said to me. It would take another 32 years before I understood exactly how true that statement was going to be. My mother, Sylvia Harmon née Aldridge, was Frances's only child. She had grown up in that same house on Magnolia Lane and had never quite let go of it emotionally, which is part of what made what happened later feel like such a deliberate calculation. My father, Raymond, had spent most of his adult life as a mid-level operations manager at a regional logistics company, and had retired 3 years ago with a modest pension and an unexamined sense of entitlement he had never been required to confront. Raymond was not a cruel man by nature. He was a compliant one, which can sometimes amount to the same thing. He did what Sylvia arranged, approved what Sylvia decided, and gave his name to things he never looked at closely enough to truly understand. They had been married for 41 years. They lived 12 minutes from that yellow house on Magnolia Lane and visited Francis every Sunday for as long as I could remember, which sounds like devotion and was, in practice, more like management. Connor Harmon, my brother, is 3 years older than me. He has our father's build and our mother's confidence and a way of entering a room that assumes the room will rearrange itself around him. He went to NC State, studied business, worked in sales, got married at 31 to a woman named Brooke, whom I like considerably more than I like Connor. And they have 2 children, a boy named Mason and a girl named Hazel, who are 8 and 6 and entirely blameless in all of this. Connor is not in the story because he is calculating by nature. He is in the story because he was convenient. He is in this story because my parents needed a vehicle for what they wanted to do, and that vehicle was him, and the reason it was him and not me was a reason that was never spoken aloud in our family, but was the operating principle of our entire household. He was a son, and I was a daughter. And in the arithmetic of Raymond and Sylvia Harmon's world, that difference had always mattered more than any of us were supposed to say. I need you to understand the shape of our family's dynamic before I go any further, because the events that follow will not make sense without it. There was a pattern of 3 things that defined how my parents moved through the world. The first was the careful performance of fairness. They would have been genuinely offended, outraged even, if you had told them they had a favorite child. But the fairness was like a stage set. It looked real from the front. If you walked around behind it, there was nothing holding it up. When Connor was 12, he threw a baseball through a neighbor's car window and my father paid for the repair out of pocket, $215, and the incident was never mentioned again. The year I was 12, I knocked a glass off the kitchen counter and my mother gave me 3 days of silence. The glass had cost $4. I understood the arithmetic of our household very early. The second thing was the ritual elevation of Connor at every public moment. When Connor started his first semester at NC State in the fall of 2001, my parents threw him a going-away party in the backyard. 34 people. My grandmother made her coconut cake. My father gave a speech about what a fine young man Connor had become. 4 years later, when I received a full merit scholarship to UNC Charlotte, my mother made lasagna. The 3 of us ate at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. My father said, "Good for you, Celeste," while looking at the television. That was the speech. The third thing was the way Francis was treated, not as a person but as a resource to be managed toward a preferred outcome. By her late 70s, Francis had a paid-off house and a brokerage account she had built carefully over 50 years of patient investing. Raymond and Sylvia visited every Sunday, yes. But after each visit, driving home, there was always a conversation I was not meant to hear as a teenager in the back seat, about what Francis might leave behind and who would need it most, and whether Francis had updated her paperwork recently. I was 15 the first time I heard that conversation. I filed it away in the part of my mind where I kept the things that would matter later. Francis and I had a relationship that existed entirely outside the borders of what my family acknowledged. We spoke on the telephone every Tuesday evening, a ritual we had maintained for 11 consecutive years. She asked me real questions and listened to real answers. She knew about my job as a financial analyst at a wealth management firm in Charlotte, my apartment on the north side, my actual life. When my mother forgot my birthday 2 years running and explained it away by saying the card must have gotten lost in the mail. It was Frances who called at 8:17 on the morning of March 5th and sang to me in her off-key contralto and then spent 40 minutes talking about whether the things that hurt us made us smaller or bigger depending on what we chose to do with them. She did not speak about my parents directly when she talked like this. She didn't need to. She had been watching them her entire adult life. In the summer of 2009, Frances was 68 years old. She had just had her estate documents reviewed by her longtime attorney, Hal Deering, a semi-retired man who had handled her affairs since the 1990s, and who had, more than once, gently suggested to Frances that she take her time and be certain before committing anything to paper. Whatever she decided that summer, she told no one, including me. She folded a copy of her decisions into her files and she did not speak about them. I did not know at that point what she had decided, or why, or what she had said to Hal Deering during that meeting. I would not know any of that for another 15 years. What I knew was this: Frances called me the following Tuesday evening, the same as always, and at the end of the call she said in a voice that was utterly ordinary, "I've been thinking about the future this week, Celeste. I think I've made the right arrangements. I wanted you to know that." She did not elaborate. She never elaborated on things she had already decided. That was one of the things I had always loved about her. In the fall of 2022, Frances began to slow. It happened gradually at first, the way daylight recedes in October. You notice it, but you adjust, and then one day you look up, and it is genuinely dark. She started forgetting words mid-sentence. She repeated herself. She called me by her younger sister Rosalind's name twice in the same phone call, which was unusual enough that I noted the date in my journal. By January of 2023, her physician at Cabarrus Internal Medicine had documented mild to moderate cognitive decline following a series of transient ischemic attacks. 2 more small strokes followed in the spring. She was hospitalized twice, once in April for 5 days, and once again in September. From the 3rd through the 22nd of September 2023. 19 days. I visited her every 3rd week during this period. I drove the 11 miles from Charlotte to Concord on Sunday afternoons and sat with her on the back porch. Sometimes she was entirely herself. Sometimes she was somewhere I couldn't reach. On one visit in late June, she took my hand across the arm of the rocker and said, with a clarity that was startling given the fog of the preceding months, "Celeste, before you leave today, I want you to look at that rosewood box on my nightstand." I went to her bedroom. The box was there. Dark rosewood, carved with a vine pattern along the lid. The size of a large shoebox. Inside were the usual things: a cameo brooch, her mother's wedding ring, and a small envelope with my name on it in Frances's handwriting. I opened the envelope. There was a single brass key on a small loop, and behind it a piece of notepaper on which Frances had written, in her careful schoolteacher's hand, the following: First Heritage Bank, South Cabarrus Branch, Box 417. You'll know when. I put the key in my pocket. I put the envelope in my purse. I went back out to the porch. Frances looked at me. "Good girl," she said. Then she turned back to watching the birds at her feeder. In August of 2023, my parents learned that Hal Deering had retired the previous spring. I believe this is when the plan solidified, though I did not know there was a plan. Within 3 weeks of learning about Hal's retirement, my mother mentioned in passing during a phone call that Frances had found a new attorney to handle her estate documents. His name was Warren Fitch. He had an office in Concord. Sylvia mentioned this in the tone she used to relay information she considered administrative and not particularly interesting, as if telling me the grocery store had rearranged its produce section. I registered it. I said nothing. Frances died on a Saturday morning in the first week of January of last year. I received the call at 6:44 in the morning. I sat on the edge of my bed for a while. Then I got up, dressed, and drove to Concord, and I was there before Raymond and Sylvia arrived, and I sat with her for 18 minutes before the family came in, and in those 18 minutes I said everything to her I needed to say, and I carried the rest of it inside me where it has lived quietly ever since. The funeral was on a Thursday. Aunt Rosalind, Frances's younger sister, flew in from Raleigh. She was 76 years old and every bit as sharp as Frances had been before the strokes, with the same pale blue eyes and the same habit of tilting her head slightly when listening to something she wanted to understand fully. She held me at the reception and held on for an extra breath. "She loved you the most," she said quietly, so no one nearby could hear. "You know that." I did know. I had always known. It was not a comfortable thing to know inside this family. But it was true, and Frances's truth had always been worth more to me than my parents' careful performances. 2 months after the funeral, at the end of March, Raymond called to say that the estate was ready to be administered and that Warren Fitch had asked all relevant parties to attend a meeting at his office. He used the phrase, "all relevant parties," in a way that made it audible that I was an afterthought rather than a party. I said I would be there. I did not mention the key. I had not mentioned the key to anyone, but I had already opened the box. On the 7th of December, 3 weeks after Frances died, I had driven to the South Cabarrus branch of First Heritage Bank on a Thursday afternoon and presented the brass key at the customer service desk. The branch manager, a composed man named Theodore Marsh, had confirmed my identity and escorted me to a small private room with a gray table and left me there with the box. I sat down. I lifted the lid. Inside there were three things: a sealed white envelope addressed in Frances's handwriting to Warren Fitch, marked "Do Not Open Unless Requested by Celeste Harmon," a second sealed envelope addressed to me, and a stapled legal document, 11 pages long, with Hal Daring's firm name at the top of the letterhead and a notarization stamp dated July 22, 2009. I read the document first. It was a will. A valid, witnessed, notarized will bearing my grandmother's signature in the familiar looping hand I had been reading on birthday cards since I was old enough to receive them. I read through the distribution clause. To my granddaughter Celeste Marie Harmon, I leave all real property including the residence at 1412 Magnolia Lane, Concord, North Carolina, and all investment accounts held in my name, to be administered as sole primary beneficiary. There was a secondary provision for Aunt Rosalind. There was a charitable bequest to a local literacy foundation. There was nothing for Raymond, nothing for Sylvia, nothing for Connor. I read it twice. Then I opened the envelope with my name on it. It was 2 pages, handwritten, dated June 9, 2023. The summer she had pointed me to the box. The summer before the September hospitalization. The summer before Warren Fitch. I will not read it in full here. But I will tell you this: Frances had written that letter knowing she was declining. She had written it knowing what her daughter would do, and she had written it with the same clear precision she had used to balance her ledgers since the 1970s. The second page ended with 4 sentences. You have never needed them to see you clearly. You have always seen yourself. Use these documents when the time comes. Don't be afraid. The numbers always tell the truth. I drove directly from the bank to the office of Diane Costello, an estate litigation attorney whose practice was 8 blocks from my firm in Charlotte. I had called ahead. She was waiting. Diane Costello was a 47-year-old woman with reading glasses she wore on top of her head when thinking and down on her nose when reading, and she switched between the two positions so frequently during our first meeting that the motion became a kind of metronome, marking the time of everything I was telling her. She had spent 19 years in estate litigation. She reviewed the documents I had brought without speaking for 22 minutes. Then she set them on the table, laced her fingers together, and looked at me. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her everything. I told her about the Sunday visits, about Hal Deering's retirement, about Warren Fitch appearing in my mother's phone call like someone had slid him in there without making a sound, about the will reading I hadn't attended yet. We were speaking in December, 3 months before the March meeting, and about the key and the box and the 2 envelopes and what they contained. I spoke for 40 minutes without stopping, and I did not cry and I did not raise my voice. And when I was finished, Diane was watching me with a stillness that I recognized as the stillness of a person who has found something to work with. "Tell me the date on Warren Fitch's document," she said. I opened the folder and found the copy I had been sent in advance of the March reading. "September 14, 2023, I said. She held her pen. She did not write anything. "And your grandmother was hospitalized that month. From the 3rd through the 22nd, I said. She looked at me. Then she said slowly, "Warren Fitch would have needed Frances to appear in his office to execute a new will, or at minimum to be present and mentally competent to confirm her signature before a notary. September 14th falls squarely inside a 19-day hospitalization." She set the pen down. "Then the date on that will is either a very careless lie or a very confident one." She paused. "In my experience, those are frequently the same thing." That was the beginning of 6 months of work. By the second week of January, I'd obtained Frances's complete hospital records from Cabarrus Medical Center through a formal statutory request. Frances had been admitted on September 3rd at 11:18 in the morning and had been discharged on September 22nd at 2:47 in the afternoon. The admission record noted altered mental status secondary to transient ischemic attack, with moderate confusion and difficulty with directed communication. The nursing notes from the week of September 14th through the 17th described a patient who was largely non-communicative, who had refused food on 2 occasions, and who'd been assessed by the attending psychiatrist as lacking the cognitive capacity to consent to elective medical procedures. I read each page. I made copies, I put them in a fireproof folder in my apartment. Kept a second copy at work, and emailed a third set to Diane. The cost of retrieving those records was $850 in processing fees and 3 weeks of waiting. Every dollar was worth it. In February, Diane retained Dr. Paulette Ng, a forensic document examiner based in Raleigh who held a doctoral degree in question document analysis and had provided expert testimony in 47 legal proceedings across North Carolina and Virginia over 11 years. I paid her retainer of $3,200 by personal check on a Thursday afternoon. She received copies of both wills, the authenticated original from the safety deposit box and Warren Fitch's document, and she spent 5 weeks with them. Her report arrived on a Monday morning in mid-March. I printed it at my office before anyone else arrived. 41 pages. I read it twice at my desk with the door closed. The conclusions were unambiguous. The signature on Warren Fitch's document bore multiple indicators of traced or simulated forgery, including inconsistent pen pressure, tremor patterns inconsistent with Francis's known signing habits, as documented on 11 years of banking records, and microscopic hesitation marks at the initiation point of each stroke. The notarization stamp bore characteristics suggesting it had been applied separately from the signature event. Dr. Ng's professional opinion, stated on page 38 in the crisp language of an expert who has spent 3 decades learning to say exactly what the evidence requires, and nothing more, was that the Warren Fitch will was not executed by Francis Aldridge. I sat at my desk. I looked out the window at Charlotte in mid-March, gray and cool, the sky the color of a held breath. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there. My grandmother had been dead for 14 months. She had put a key in a box and given it to me 3 years before she died because she had known. She had prepared for it with the same patient, meticulous care she had used to build her brokerage account over 5 decades. She had been doing what the numbers do, waiting to be read correctly. Meanwhile, my parents had moved forward with the estate administration with no sign of awareness that anything was wrong. In February, my mother texted me a photograph of Francis's living room with a new area rug that Connor and Brooke had put down. The caption read, "They're making it their own." In March, Connor sold Francis's 2016 Honda Accord for $6,500 and sent me a text that said, "Finally getting things cleared out." I responded with a thumbs-up emoji. I was doing what I had always done in this family, being invisible. I had always been best at that, and it had never served me as well as it was about to. In April, Aunt Rosalind called me on a Tuesday evening. Without preamble, she said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to tell me the truth." "All right," I said. "Did Francis leave you something? Something besides that jewelry box they read out? Why do you ask?" "Because Francis called me in the fall of 2009, Rosalind said. "After she saw Hal Deering, she told me she'd made a decision she felt good about. She said she'd left things to the one who would take care of them properly. She didn't use your name, but she described you. She said, 'The one who calls me every Tuesday.'" I listened. "I have thought about that for 15 years, Rosalind said. "And then I watched that reading. And I watched you sit there with that portfolio in your lap. And I thought, Celeste is not quiet because she's lost. She's quiet because she's thinking." I told her. "Not everything." "Enough. Tell me what you need from me," she said. "I may need you to testify," I said. "I am 76 years old," Rosalind said, "and I have been waiting a very long time to say something true about this family in a room where people cannot look away. Tell me when and where." I told her to hold that thought. By June, Diane had filed the formal will contest with the probate court in Cabarrus County. The grounds were clear. The Fitch document was invalid on the basis of fraud and execution under circumstances of the testator's known incapacity. The authentic will, supported by Hal Deering's notarized affidavit confirming he had prepared the original document in July of 2009, was submitted as the true expression of Francis Aldridge's testamentary intent. Warren Fitch was notified by certified mail. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in the third week of November. My mother called me in early July. Her voice had a quality I had not heard before. Not quite accusatory. Not quite concerned. Something in between, searching for a tone that would make me behave like someone who did not know what I knew. "Celeste, there's some confusion about Mother's estate. We got a notification from a law firm." "I know," I said. "You know." "Yes." A pause. "Celeste, what is going on?" "There's a hearing in November," I said. "You'll receive all the documentation through Warren Fitch. I don't have anything to add right now." "Your brother," she started. "I know," I said again. I could hear her breath. "We are your parents." "I know that," I said. "I'll see you in November." I hung up. My father called 2 days later. He was calmer. He said, "Celeste, is this really what you want? Dragging this through a courtroom?" "Dad," I said, "Grandma Frances left me her estate. She was specific about it. She wrote it down, had it notarized, and personally gave me the key to the evidence. I don't think it's accurate to say I'm dragging anything anywhere." I paused. "I'll see you at the hearing." Connor called once in September. He said, "Just tell me what you actually want here." "I want what Grandma left me," I said. "The will says different. The authentic will says exactly what I told you." He hung up. I went back to work. I paid my rent. I called Aunt Rosalind every Tuesday. I slept well. This was the part they could not understand and never would. I had not been angry for a single day of those 6 months. What I felt was something closer to steady, something closer to the certainty of a number that has been checked and rechecked and always comes out the same. In October, Diane and I met 9 times. I read every page of every document until I could recite the page numbers. I kept a running spreadsheet of the evidence chain, the original will, Hal Deering's affidavit, the hospital records, Dr. Spoden, Ang Gee's 41-page report, the first Heritage Bank access log showing my authorized entry to Box 417 on December 7th. Near the end of October, Diane asked what I was most afraid of. "I'm afraid the judge will think I fabricated the key," I said. "That there's no way to prove Francis gave it to me personally." Diane slid a piece of paper across the table. It was the security log from First Heritage Bank, obtained through subpoena. It showed that Box 417 had been accessed 4 times between 2009 and last December. 3 of those accesses were by Frances Aldridge herself. The last one of hers was dated 2 months before she had pointed me to the box. The 4th access was mine, on December 7th. "The bank keeps a signature log," Diane said. 3 signatures are Frances's, the 4th is yours. The box was last accessed by its owner 2 months before she gave you the key." She looked at me. "She planned this for 15 years, Celeste. She didn't just leave you the will, she left you the proof of the will." I sat with that for a long moment. "That's what she meant," I said quietly. "The numbers always tell the truth." The week before the hearing, I drove to Concord one last time, not to anyone's house. To the yellow house on Magnolia Lane, which still technically belonged to Frances's estate pending the hearing's outcome. The locks had been changed to ones Connor had installed. I did not try to go inside. I stood on the sidewalk at 10:43 in the morning on a Tuesday, with the wind coming from the north and the oak trees going gold and copper the way they do in the Carolina Piedmont in October. I looked at my grandmother's house for 4 minutes. Then I walked back to my car and drove to Charlotte and worked until late that evening on the final review of Diane's evidence binders. If you're still with me right now, and I am so grateful that you are, I want to pause and ask you something. Have you ever held a truth so carefully for so long that the weight of it actually felt like peace? Because that is what those 6 months felt like. If you have ever been in that place, leave me a comment below and tell me about it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that right now. Every subscriber helps these stories reach the women who need to hear them. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November, in courtroom 4 of the Cabarrus County Courthouse in Concord. I arrived at 8:22. Diane was already at the respondent's table with 2 organized binders in front of her, reading glasses on her nose. She looked up when I entered and gave me a single nod. Warren Fitch arrived at 8:45 with Raymond and Sylvia and Connor. They came in together. Sylvia was wearing the same cream blouse she had worn to the March will reading. Raymond had the charcoal sport coat. Connor wore a dark suit I had not seen before. None of them looked at me when they entered. Warren Fitch set his briefcase on the petitioner's table and opened it with the composure of a man who had not yet considered the possibility that this morning might not go as planned. Aunt Rosalind arrived at 8:52 and took a seat in the gallery directly behind me. She was wearing a dark navy dress and Frances's strand of pearls. She placed her hand on my shoulder for exactly 3 seconds. That was enough. There were 7 people in the gallery. Theodore Marsh, branch manager of the South Cabarrus First Heritage Bank, sat at the far end of the gallery row. He had arrived at 8:15, before I had, holding a sealed evidence envelope that Diane's office had subpoenaed. The envelope contained the complete contents of Safety Deposit Box 417, the original authenticated will, the letter Frances had written to me, and the bank's internal access documentation. The Honorable Judge Patricia Wellman entered at 9:04. She was in her early 60s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and she surveyed the courtroom with the brief, precise attention of someone who has heard many claims in this room and is interested primarily in documentation. Warren Fitch opened for the petitioner. He was competent and brief. He presented the Fitch will dated September 14, 2023. He introduced the notarization documentation. He stated that Frances Aldridge had been seen at his office on that date. He did not elaborate on the circumstances of that visit. He did not, perhaps, believe he needed to. Diane rose. She said she wished to introduce 3 categories of evidence and asked the court's permission to call Theodore Marsh from the gallery. Warren Fitch straightened slightly. My mother touched my father's arm beneath the table. I kept my eyes forward. Mr. Marsh approached the front of the courtroom with the sealed envelope. Diane asked him to identify it. He confirmed its provenance. It contained the complete contents of Box 417, retrieved under court subpoena and held in sealed condition since the preceding Friday. Judge Wellman instructed him to open it. He lifted the flap. He removed 3 items and set them on the clerk's table. Diane retrieved them. She asked Mr. Belk, Marsh, to confirm the access log. Who had accessed the box and when. He confirmed 3 accesses by Frances Aldridge between 2009 and 2022, 1 access by Celeste Marie Harmon on December 7 of the preceding year. He confirmed that Frances Aldridge had added Celeste Harmon as an authorized secondary accessor by written request in 2012, 11 years before she died. She had added me 11 years before she died. I had not known that. I sat very still. Diane then presented the Hal Deering will, the authenticated original from July of 2009, alongside his notarized affidavit confirming his memory of the document and the circumstances of its preparation. She presented Dr. Paulette Ing's 41-page forensic report, moving through its conclusions methodically. Inconsistent pen pressure, tremor patterns incompatible with Frances's established signing habits, hesitation marks at the initiation of every stroke, a notarization stamp bearing the characteristics of separate application. Dr. Ing's opinion, the Fitch will, was not executed by Frances Aldridge. Then Diane presented the hospital records. She turned slightly toward the petitioner's table. The will presented by opposing counsel bears the date of September 14, 2023. The medical records from Cabarrus Medical Center, subpoenaed and authenticated, show that Frances Aldridge was admitted on September 3 at 11:18 in the morning and discharged on September 22. Nursing notes from September 14 describe a patient assessed as lacking cognitive capacity for directed communication. A psychiatric evaluation from September 15 states that the patient was unable to comprehend or respond to simple yes or no questions. She paused to let that sit in the room. Warren Fitch's office is 14 minutes from Cabarrus Medical Center. There is no transport record, no ambulance log, no notation in Frances Aldridge's medical file documenting any departure from the facility on September 14. She was not at his office on that date. She was medically and cognitively incapable of being there. The courtroom was quiet. My father's hands, which had been flat on the table at the March will reading, were not flat now. One was gripping the edge of his chair. My mother was looking at the wall behind the judge's bench with the expression of someone who has stepped onto ice and understood, too late, that it will not hold. Connor looked at his own hands and did not look up. I looked at none of them. I watched Judge Wellman read the hospital records. Warren Fitch asked to be heard. He offered a brief explanation about date confusion, about office records being subject to review, about a different visit, a different occasion. Judge Wellman looked at him over her reading glasses. "Counselor," she said, "is there a transport record?" There was not. "Is there a nursing departure notation?" There was not. She set down the hospital records. She looked at the forensic report. She looked at Hal Deering's affidavit. "I'm going to take a brief recess," she said. 15 minutes. She was back in 11. "This court finds the will presented by petitioner to be of contested validity," she said. "And in light of the documentary and forensic evidence presented by respondent, I am granting immediate probate of the authenticated will prepared by Harold Deering in July of 2009. She looked at Warren Fitch. "I am also referring the matter of the September 14th document to the Cabarrus County District Attorney's Office for review." She said several other things about the administrative process. I heard them all. But what I will remember for the rest of my life about that moment is not the judge's words. It is the sound of my mother's breath leaving her body, and the way Aunt Rosalind placed her hand on my shoulder from behind and held it there. Warren Fitch packed his briefcase with the careful movements of a man performing a task he does not want to be watched performing. My father stood before the session was fully adjourned. Judge Wellman gave him a look that was not unkind, but was final. He sat back down. My mother turned and looked at me directly. For the first time since we had entered the courtroom, I held her gaze. I had nothing to say in that room. I had already said everything there was to say on the pages Diane had submitted. My mother's eyes searched my face for something. Guilt, maybe, or remorse. Or the particular wound she could press to reopen a conversation she could control. She found none of it. I was not angry. I was not triumphant. I was simply myself, in that courtroom, the same person I had been for 38 years. The only thing that had changed was that the numbers had been read aloud in front of everyone, and the truth was no longer something that could be quietly managed. Aunt Rosalind was waiting for me in the hallway. She looked 10 years younger than she had in October. She hugged me without speaking. When she stepped back, her eyes were bright. "Frances would have been beside herself," she said. "She planned it," I said. "All of it. She just needed me to be patient enough." Rosalind looked at me for a long moment. "She was right to trust you." "We trusted each other," I said. The calls from my family started that same evening. My mother called at 6:17. I let it go to voicemail. Again at 7:41. Voicemail again. My father called at 9:08 and left a message I did not listen to until the following morning. He said, "Celeste, I know you're not picking up. I know you think what we did was wrong, but we're your parents. Whatever happened in that courtroom, we're still your parents. Please call me back." There was something genuine in his voice. I believe that. I believe Raymond Harmon does not fully allow himself to think of what was done as wrong, and that the grace he extends to himself in that regard is not mine to remove. Connor called 4 days later on a Sunday evening at 8:53. He said, "I want you to know that Mom and Dad told me the will was legitimate. I want you to know I didn't know it wasn't." A pause. "I'm not sure you believe that." I sat with it for a moment. "I believe you knew what you wanted to be true," I said carefully. "I think that's different from not knowing." "What does that mean?" "It means that if you had asked to see the original documents, if you had been even a little curious about the fact that you were receiving $840,000 and I was receiving a jewelry box, you could have found the answer. The answer was always there, but you didn't ask." I paused. "I think you already knew why." He was quiet for a long time. We ended the call shortly after. My mother called a final time. 2 weeks after the hearing, on a Wednesday evening at 10:12, which meant she had been sitting with the silence long enough that it had become unbearable. "Whatever you think of me," she said when I answered, "I was doing what I thought was best for this family. Your brother has a wife and 2 children. You have a salary. You are capable. I made a judgment. It wasn't fair, maybe. But I made it out of love. I let her finish. Mom, I said, when Frances was in the hospital in September of 2023, when she couldn't communicate, when the nursing notes described her as unable to answer yes or no questions, did you know that document was being signed? Silence. That's what I thought, I said. I kept my voice exactly level, not raised, not lowered. I want to say something to you clearly because I want you to know I mean it, and that I have thought about it carefully. I don't hate you. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life in anger at you. But I cannot pretend that what happened was a mistake in judgment. A mistake in judgment is miscalculating a budget. What happened here was a 15-year plan that required my grandmother to be incapacitated before it could be executed. I know the difference between those things. Another silence. I'll be in touch about the estate transfer through Diane's office, I said. Please direct any questions there. I hung up. That was 4 months ago. I have not spoken to either of my parents since. The matter referred to the district attorney's office is ongoing and is not mine to discuss. The house on Magnolia Lane is mine now. I drove to Concord on the first Saturday of December, the weekend after the transfer was completed. Connor and Brooke had taken their rug and several things from the kitchen, but had otherwise left the house as Frances had kept it. The rocking chairs were still on the back porch. The wind chime was still there. The wall of photographs in the hallway was unchanged. Frances's ledger, the one from the 1970s, the one she had shown a 6-year-old girl at a kitchen table 32 years ago, was still on the shelf in the second bedroom where she kept her books. I threw away the dead herb pots and bought new ones at the garden center. I sat in one of the rocking chairs for an hour and watched the birds at the feeder. Then I went inside and made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where she had first taught me that the numbers always tell the truth. The week after the hearing, Aunt Rosalind and I had dinner at a small restaurant in Concord with white tablecloths and good wine. We sat for 3 hours. We talked about Frances the way you can only talk about someone once they are gone. All of it, the full dimensions of who she had been. The funny parts and the hard parts, and the parts that were quietly extraordinary in the way ordinary people's lives become extraordinary when you bother to see them with care. Rosalind told me something I had not known. She said that in 2009, after Frances's meeting with Hal Daring, Frances had called her and said, "I am leaving everything to Celeste because she is the only one who calls me on Tuesdays just to talk. Not because of a calculation about need, not because of anything strategic. Because of the Tuesday calls. Because I had called every week for years, not to ask for anything, simply because Frances was the most interesting person I knew and I wanted to talk to her." Rosalind looked across the table at me. She said, "The Tuesday girl has always known how to be still. She will know what to do." I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. This is what I want to say to you if you are watching this and you recognize something in this story. Not about the inheritance. Not about the documents or the forensic examiner or the courtroom. Those are the mechanics of it. What I want to say is this. My grandmother knew she was dying. She knew what her daughter would do. And instead of confronting it, instead of forcing a reckoning that would only have produced conflict and grief in her final months, she chose something different. She chose patience. She chose documentation. She chose to put her faith not in the hope that people would change, but in the certainty that the truth, if you keep it safe and give it the right conditions, will eventually speak for itself. She had been doing that for 15 years. She had been choosing me, quietly and without fanfare. For 15 years, the way you choose a tree when you plant it. Not because you'll be there to see it grow to full height, but because you believe in the growing. The difference between patience and passivity is everything. My grandmother was not passive. She was making active choices every year for 15 years. She was protecting the truth. She was building a case from the ground up and leaving it for me to find at exactly the right moment. There is a profound kind of faith in that. A faith in the person you have chosen. A faith in the durability of what is real. If you were the overlooked one in your family, if you were the one who was passed over, diminished, handed a jewelry box while someone else was handed the estate, I want you to hear something. Being invisible is not the same as being unimportant. Being passed over is not the same as being worth less. The people who minimize you are counting on you to agree with their assessment of you. They are counting on you to internalize their version of you so thoroughly that you stop building evidence to the contrary. Do not agree. Do not internalize. Build. Document. Wait. The truth is always in a box somewhere. Your only job is to find it, hold it carefully, and be patient enough to let it do its work in its own time. That was the moment I stopped being the daughter they overlooked and started understanding that I had never needed them to see me. Frances had seen me. She had been seeing me since I was 6 years old at that kitchen table. And in the end, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. I want to ask you this. If you had been sitting in that courtroom, if you had spent 6 months carrying that portfolio, those records, that key, and you had watched your family's faces settle into relief as that forged will was read aloud, what would you have done? Would you have opened the envelope? Would you have been patient enough to wait? Tell me in the comments below. Tell me your story. Because the reason this channel exists is that these stories matter. Every single one. The women in them matter. You matter. To everyone who listened all the way to the end of this story, thank you. Genuinely thank you. You gave your time and your attention to a story that deserved it, and that is not a small thing. These stories exist because real women carry real weight in silence, and that silence deserves a voice. If this one stayed with you, if it made you feel less alone in something you've been carrying, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Executive Revenge Stories so you never miss a comeback. We are here every week, and every week the women in these stories remind me, and I hope they remind you, that the loudest comebacks are always, always built in silence. We will see you next time.